What would you do if you witnessed a father's cruelty toward his own disabled child, knowing that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places? In the sprawling hills of Colorado, wealthy businessman Vincent Sterling was about to learn that when you break an innocent heart, the consequences can come from directions you never imagined, and that sometimes animals understand justice better than humans do. Vincent Sterling was the kind of man who measured everything in terms of profit, success, and image. At 52 years old, he had built a financial empire that stretched across 3 states, owning everything from luxury hotels to cattle ranches. His estate outside of Boulder was a testament to his wealth, a massive compound featuring a 20-room mansion, championship-quality stables, and thousands of acres of pristine Colorado wilderness. To the outside world, Vincent appeared to have everything a man could want: money, power, and influence that extended to the highest levels of society. But behind the facade of success lived a darkness that Vincent worked hard to hide from public view. His wife, Catherine, had died in childbirth 8 years earlier, leaving him to raise their son alone. That son, 8-year-old Timothy, was born with cerebral palsy, a condition that affected his movement and speech, but left his mind sharp and his heart full of love that his father seemed incapable of returning. Timothy was a gentle, intelligent boy who spent most of his time in a wheelchair or using specialized walking equipment. Despite his physical challenges, he had an infectious smile and a natural curiosity about the world that should have made any parent proud. He loved animals with a passion that was remarkable to witness, and he had an uncanny ability to connect with creatures that others found difficult to handle. But Vincent saw his son's disability as nothing more than an embarrassment, a blemish on the perfect image he worked so hard to maintain. He hired the best nannies and therapists that money could buy, not out of love for Timothy, but because he wanted to minimize the disruption that his son's condition caused to his business and social life. The staff at the Sterling estate, led by longtime housekeeper Rosa Martinez, did their best to provide Timothy with the love and attention that his father withheld. Rosa had worked for the family since before Timothy's birth, and she had watched with growing concern as Vincent's coldness toward his son became more pronounced with each passing year. "That boy needs his father's love," Rosa would tell Maria Santos, the cook, during their quiet conversations in the kitchen. "All the money in the world can't replace a parent's affection, and Mr. Sterling is breaking that child's heart a little more each day." Timothy's world was largely confined to his room and the enclosed garden area that Vincent had built specifically to keep his son out of sight when business associates or social contacts visited the estate. The boy's greatest treasures were his collection of toy animals, detailed figurines that he used to create elaborate fantasy worlds where all creatures were loved and protected. The centerpiece of Timothy's collection was a magnificent toy bull, carved from wood by a local artisan and painted with remarkable detail. Timothy called him Brave, and the toy had become his constant companion. He would spend hours creating stories about Brave's adventures, tales of courage and friendship that helped him cope with the loneliness that filled his young life. "Brave protects all the other animals," Timothy would tell Rosa as she helped him arrange his toys for one of his elaborate play sessions. "He's strong and kind, and he never lets anyone hurt the ones who can't protect themselves." The irony of Timothy's devotion to his toy protector was not lost on the estate staff, who knew that the boy himself desperately needed someone to protect him from his father's emotional cruelty. Vincent rarely spoke to Timothy except to issue orders or criticisms, and he had made it clear to everyone that his son was to remain invisible whenever important visitors came to the ranch. The vast Sterling estate was also home to actual livestock, including a prize-winning herd of Highland cattle that Vincent had purchased more for prestige than profit. Among these animals was a massive bull named Ranger, a magnificent specimen who stood nearly 6 feet at the shoulder and weighed over 2,000 pounds. Ranger had shaggy reddish-brown hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything happening around him. Unlike the other cattle, Ranger had developed an unusual habit of positioning himself near the house, particularly in areas where he could observe the enclosed garden where Timothy spent his days. The ranch hands had noticed that the bull seemed unusually calm and attentive when the boy was outside, almost as if he was watching over him. "That bull's got more sense than most people," observed ranch foreman Jake Coleman during one of his conversations with Rosa. "He knows that boy needs protecting, even if his own father doesn't seem to care." The relationship between Vincent and Timothy reached a breaking point on a cold December evening when Vincent was expecting an important business delegation from Chicago. The visitors represented a potential deal worth millions of dollars, and Vincent was determined that nothing would interfere with the negotiations. Timothy, who had been playing quietly in his room with his beloved toy collection, accidentally knocked over a glass of water while arranging his animals. The sound of the breaking glass echoed through the house, reaching Vincent's study where he was reviewing documents for the crucial meeting. Vincent's reaction was swift and brutal. He stormed into Timothy's room, his face twisted with a rage that terrified the young boy. "You worthless little cripple!" Vincent snarled, his voice filled with venom that made Timothy shrink back in his wheelchair. "I have the most important meeting of my career tonight, and you can't even manage to sit still without breaking something." Timothy's eyes filled with tears as he looked up at his father with a mixture of fear and desperate hope for understanding. "I'm sorry, Daddy," he whispered, his speech slightly slurred due to his condition. "It was an accident. I was just playing with Brave and the other animals, and I didn't mean to—" "Enough!" Vincent roared, his voice echoing through the room. "I'm sick of your excuses, and I'm sick of this mess you call playing. These toys are turning you into even more of a useless dreamer than you already are." Without warning, Vincent began grabbing Timothy's precious toy animals from their carefully arranged positions around the room. The boy cried out in alarm, reaching desperately from his wheelchair to try to save his treasures, but his father was too quick and too strong. "Daddy, please!" Timothy sobbed, his voice breaking with anguish. "Please don't hurt them. They're my friends." But Vincent was beyond reason, consumed by a fury that had been building for years, and now had found its target in the innocent toys that brought his disabled son the only joy in his lonely world. He gathered armfuls of the carefully crafted animals, including the beloved wooden bull that Timothy called Brave, and headed for the door. "Maybe this will teach you to focus on reality instead of living in your pathetic fantasy world," Vincent said coldly, as Timothy's desperate cries followed him from the room. Outside in the garden, Vincent built a pile of Timothy's toys in a metal fire barrel that the groundskeepers used for burning yard waste. As he doused the collection with lighter fluid, he could hear his son's heartbroken sobbing coming from the house, but the sound only seemed to fuel his determination to complete this act of cruelty. What Vincent didn't notice, as he prepared to destroy the treasures that meant everything to his disabled son, was the massive figure of Ranger standing at the fence that separated the garden area from the main pasture. The Highland bull's intelligent eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding before him, and something in the animal's expression suggested that he understood exactly what was happening and was not pleased by what he saw. As Vincent struck the match that would ignite Timothy's precious collection, Ranger let out a low, rumbling sound that seemed to echo with disapproval across the entire estate. It was a sound that spoke of judgment, of justice delayed but not forgotten, and of consequences that would soon come calling for a man who had crossed a line that should never be crossed. The flames that consumed Timothy's beloved toy collection cast dancing shadows across the Colorado estate as Vincent Sterling stood watching his son's treasures turn to ash. The wooden bull that Timothy had called Brave was among the last to catch fire, its carefully painted details disappearing as the flames devoured 8 years of a disabled boy's hopes and dreams. From inside the house, Timothy's heartbroken sobs could be heard echoing through the winter night, but Vincent felt only satisfaction at having eliminated what he saw as a distraction from reality. What Vincent failed to notice in his moment of cruel triumph was that he was not alone in witnessing this act of destruction. Ranger, the massive Highland bull, had pressed himself against the fence that separated the pasture from the garden area, his intelligent dark eyes fixed on every detail of the scene unfolding before him. The 2,000-pound animal stood perfectly still, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was memorizing everything he saw, filing away each moment for future consideration. As the last of the toys crumbled into charred remnants, Vincent dusted off his hands and headed back toward the house, where his important business guests would be arriving within the hour. He had eliminated the source of the noise and disruption, and now he could focus on the multi-million-dollar deal that would further expand his empire. Timothy's crying had finally subsided into exhausted whimpers, which Vincent considered an additional victory in his campaign to teach his son about the harsh realities of life. Inside the house, Rosa Martinez had done her best to comfort the inconsolable boy, but Timothy's grief was beyond what words could heal. The loss of his toy animals, especially his beloved Brave, had shattered something fundamental in the child's spirit. He sat in his wheelchair staring out the window toward the garden where the fire barrel still smoldered, tears streaming down his face as he tried to process what his father had done. "Why did Daddy burn them, Rosa?" Timothy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They never hurt anybody. They were just toys that made me happy." Rosa gathered the boy into her arms, her own heart breaking for the pain she saw in his eyes. "I don't know, mijo," she said softly, using the Spanish term of endearment she had called him since he was a baby. "Sometimes people do cruel things when they forget how to love. But you remember this. You are worth so much more than your father understands, and someday he's going to regret what he did tonight." Before we continue with this heartbreaking story and the justice that was about to unfold, I need to ask you for something that would mean the world to me. If you're feeling angry about Vincent's cruelty toward his innocent son, and you're hoping that somehow justice will be served, please take just 1 second to hit that like button below. Your support helps these important stories about standing up for the vulnerable reach more people who need to hear them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell, because what Ranger is about to do will prove that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places, and that animals often have a better sense of right and wrong than the humans who think they're superior. Now let's get back to Timothy and the bull who was about to become his unlikely protector. The business meeting that Vincent had prioritized over his son's emotional well-being proceeded exactly as he had planned. The delegation from Chicago was impressed by the estate's grandeur and Vincent's reputation for ruthless efficiency. By midnight, they had signed preliminary agreements that would net Vincent Sterling an additional $50 million over the next 3 years. As far as Vincent was concerned, the evening had been a complete success. But success has a way of making people careless, and Vincent's sense of triumph blinded him to the changes that were already beginning to occur around his estate. The morning after the toy burning, ranch foreman Jake Coleman noticed that Ranger's behavior had shifted dramatically. The Highland bull, who had always been calm and manageable, was now displaying signs of agitation and hypervigilance. "That bull's been pacing the fence line all night," Jake told Rosa as she prepared breakfast in the kitchen. "He keeps staring toward the house like he's waiting for something. I've been working with cattle for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like it." Rosa glanced out the window toward the pasture where Ranger stood motionless, his massive frame silhouetted against the early morning sky. There was something different about the bull's posture, something that reminded her of a sentinel standing guard. "Animals see things we don't," she said quietly. "Maybe he knows something we don't." Throughout the following days, Ranger's behavior became increasingly focused and purposeful. He had taken up a permanent position near the fence closest to the house, and his attention seemed entirely devoted to observing Vincent's movements around the estate. When Vincent appeared in the garden or walked between buildings, Ranger would track his progress with unwavering intensity. Timothy, meanwhile, had retreated into a depression that worried everyone who cared about him. The boy who had once filled his days with imaginative play now sat quietly in his wheelchair, staring out the window with vacant eyes. He rarely spoke, ate very little, and showed no interest in the replacement toys that Rosa had quietly purchased for him. "It's not about the toys themselves," Dr. Patricia Williams, Timothy's therapist, explained to Rosa during one of her visits. "Those animals represented safety, love, and protection in Timothy's world. When his father destroyed them, he destroyed Timothy's sense that there was anything good left in his life." Vincent, absorbed in his business success and planning for future deals, barely noticed his son's deteriorating condition. When he did acknowledge Timothy's presence, it was only to express irritation at the boy's sulking and to demand that he snap out of it and act normal. But Ranger was paying attention to everything. The bull had developed an uncanny ability to predict Vincent's movements around the estate, positioning himself at vantage points where he could observe the man's interactions with his son. When Vincent spoke harshly to Timothy or dismissed the boy's attempts at conversation, Ranger's massive head would lower and his breathing would become heavier, as if he was containing some powerful emotion. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the toy burning. Vincent had been drinking heavily the night before while entertaining business associates, and he woke with a hangover that made him even more irritable than usual. When he encountered Timothy in the hallway outside his room, the sight of his son's wheelchair and the reminder of his burden sent Vincent into another rage. "I'm sick of looking at your pathetic face moping around this house," Vincent snarled at the boy. "Your mother died bringing you into this world, and all you've done since then is remind me of everything I lost. Maybe it would have been better if you had died with her." The words hit Timothy like physical blows, and the boy began to cry with a grief that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Rosa, who had heard the commotion from the kitchen, came running to intervene, but the damage had already been done. Timothy's remaining spirit seemed to shatter completely under the weight of his father's cruelty. What none of them realized was that Ranger had heard every word. The bull's exceptional hearing had allowed him to detect the conversation through the open windows, and Vincent's declaration that his disabled son should have died was the final straw that pushed the animal beyond the boundaries of patience. That afternoon, as Vincent strutted around the estate making phone calls and planning his next business venture, Ranger began to test the strength of the fence that had contained him for so long. The Highland bull's massive frame pressed against the wooden rails with increasing force, and the sound of splintering wood echoed across the pasture. Jake Coleman noticed the damage during his evening rounds and immediately called for reinforcements to repair the fence. "We need to get this fixed tonight," he told his crew. "That bull's acting strange, and I don't want him getting loose near the house." But as the workers labored to strengthen the barriers that held Ranger in the pasture, the bull stood watching them with eyes that seemed to burn with purpose. He had witnessed too much cruelty, heard too many heartless words, and seen too much pain inflicted on an innocent child who deserved protection rather than persecution. The fence repairs were completed by midnight, but Ranger's vigil continued. He stood in the darkness, his massive form barely visible in the moonlight, waiting for the right moment to deliver the justice that Timothy's father had earned through his acts of unconscionable cruelty. Vincent Sterling had destroyed his son's treasures and broken the boy's spirit, believing that wealth and power made him untouchable. But he was about to learn that some lines should never be crossed, and that sometimes justice comes not from courts or laws, but from the moral clarity of a creature who understands the difference between right and wrong better than the humans who consider themselves superior. The morning that would change everything on the Sterling estate dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the Colorado mountains like nature itself was preparing for what was about to unfold. Vincent Sterling woke with his usual sense of self-satisfaction, planning another day of business calls and deal-making, completely unaware that his treatment of Timothy had set in motion forces beyond his control or understanding. Ranger had spent the night systematically weakening the fence posts that held him in the pasture, using his massive weight and strength to create stress fractures in the wood that would be invisible to casual observation, but would fail under the right pressure. The Highland bull's intelligence was far greater than Vincent had ever imagined, and his patience was matched only by his determination to see justice done for the innocent child whose spirit had been broken by his own father. Timothy sat in his wheelchair by his bedroom window, staring out at the garden where the ashes of his beloved toys still stained the fire barrel. The boy had barely spoken since his father's cruel declaration that he should have died with his mother, and Rosa was growing increasingly worried about his failure to eat or engage with the world around him. "Mijo, you need to try to eat something," Rosa pleaded as she brought Timothy his breakfast on a tray decorated with cartoon animals. But the sight of the cheerful images only reminded the boy of what he had lost, and he turned away without taking a single bite. Vincent, meanwhile, was in his study taking a video conference call with investors in New York, his back turned to the window that looked out over the pasture where Ranger waited. The bull's timing was perfect. Vincent was alone in the room, separated from the rest of the household by thick walls that would muffle any sounds of distress. The moment Vincent ended his call and stood up from his desk, Ranger made his move. With a surge of power that sent wooden posts flying like toothpicks, the massive bull broke through the fence and charged directly toward the house. His hooves thundered against the frozen ground as he covered the distance to the garden in a matter of seconds, his eyes fixed on the man who had shown such cruelty to his own child. Vincent heard the sound of splintering wood and turned toward the window just in time to see 2,000 pounds of enraged Highland bull bearing down on him. The sight sent pure terror racing through his veins as he realized that his wealth and position meant nothing to an animal that had appointed itself as Timothy's protector and judge. "What the hell?" Vincent managed to gasp before Ranger crashed through the garden gate, reducing the expensive wrought iron barrier to twisted metal. The bull's eyes were blazing with an intelligence and purpose that made it clear this was no random animal attack. This was deliberate, calculated justice being delivered by a creature who had witnessed too much cruelty and decided that enough was enough. Vincent stumbled backward from the window, his heart racing as he tried to process what was happening. Through the glass, he could see Ranger systematically destroying everything in the garden that belonged to him, the rare flowers he had imported from Europe, the expensive outdoor furniture, the decorative statues that had cost thousands of dollars each. But the bull's destruction was surgical in its precision, targeting only Vincent's possessions while carefully avoiding anything that might belong to Timothy or the household staff. The sound of Ranger's rampage brought Rosa and Jake Coleman running from different parts of the estate. Rosa immediately understood what was happening and felt a grim satisfaction as she watched the bull deliver the comeuppance that Vincent so richly deserved. Jake, meanwhile, was amazed by the intelligence and selectivity of the animal's actions. "He's not just destroying things randomly," Jake observed as they watched from a safe distance. "He knows exactly what belongs to Mr. Sterling, and he's targeting only those items. I've never seen anything like it." Vincent, trapped in his study with Ranger prowling just outside the windows, began to understand that his treatment of Timothy had consequences he had never anticipated. The bull seemed to know exactly who he was and what he had done, and the animal's actions were clearly motivated by a sense of justice that Vincent had never believed animals possessed. The systematic destruction continued for over an hour, with Ranger methodically demolishing every symbol of Vincent's wealth and status that he could reach. The bull reduced Vincent's prized luxury car to scrap metal, trampled his award-winning garden into mud, and demolished the gazebo where Vincent had hosted countless business meetings. Throughout it all, Ranger's movements were controlled and purposeful, never showing the blind rage of a maddened animal, but rather the calculated actions of a creature executing a plan. Timothy, drawn to his window by the sounds of destruction, watched in amazement as the bull he had observed from afar carried out what could only be described as revenge on his behalf. For the first time since his toys had been burned, the boy's eyes showed a spark of life and something that might have been hope. "He's angry about what Daddy did to me," Timothy whispered to Rosa, who had come to check on him during the chaos. "Ranger saw everything, and he's making Daddy pay for being mean." Rosa looked at the boy with surprise, realizing that Timothy had been watching the bull just as intently as Ranger had been watching the family. "You think Ranger is doing this for you, mijo?" Timothy nodded solemnly, his young mind processing the connection between his father's cruelty and the bull's justice with a clarity that adults often lack. Animals know when people are good or bad. Ranger knows Daddy hurt me, and he's making sure Daddy knows it was wrong. The climax of Ranger's demonstration came when the bull approached the study windows where Vincent cowered inside. The massive animal pressed his face against the glass, his dark eyes staring directly into Vincent's terrified gaze with an intelligence that was impossible to deny. For several long moments, man and bull regarded each other through the barrier of glass, and Vincent found himself looking into eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul and find it wanting. Then, with deliberate precision, Ranger raised one massive hoof and brought it down on the decorative fountain that Vincent had imported from Italy at a cost of $50,000. The priceless sculpture shattered into 1,000 pieces, the sound echoing across the estate like a final judgment rendered. Having made his point with unmistakable clarity, Ranger turned and walked calmly back toward the pasture, his massive frame moving with the dignity of someone who has completed an important task. He positioned himself next to the ruined fence and stood waiting, making no attempt to flee or continue his rampage. His message had been delivered, and justice had been served in the only language that Vincent Sterling seemed capable of understanding. Jake Coleman and his crew approached Ranger cautiously, expecting to find a dangerous animal that would need to be tranquilized or destroyed. Instead, they found a calm, intelligent bull who allowed himself to be led back into a temporary enclosure without any resistance. It was as if Ranger understood that his work was finished and he was ready to accept whatever consequences might follow. Vincent emerged from his study on shaking legs, surveying the hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage that Ranger had inflicted with surgical precision. Every symbol of his wealth and status lay in ruins, but not a single item belonging to Timothy or the household staff had been touched. The message was impossible to misinterpret. The bull had delivered justice for a father's cruelty to his disabled son, and the precision of the attack left no doubt that it had been intentional. As Vincent stood among the wreckage of his material possessions, he found himself thinking about his son for the first time in years, not as a burden or embarrassment, but as a human being who deserved love and protection. The terror he had felt while cowering in his study had given him a glimpse of the fear and helplessness that Timothy lived with every day, and the realization began to crack the shell of selfishness that had surrounded his heart for so long. Ranger's justice had been swift, comprehensive, and undeniably effective. Vincent Sterling had learned that some actions have consequences that go far beyond human law or social convention, and that sometimes the moral clarity of an animal can deliver lessons that no amount of human reasoning could accomplish. The bull had seen everything, remembered everything, and when the time was right, he had made sure that justice was served in his own powerful way. 6 months after Ranger's powerful demonstration of justice, The Sterling estate had been transformed in ways that went far beyond the physical repairs to the property. Vincent Sterling, the man who had once measured his worth solely in terms of wealth and business success, was learning to see the world through entirely different eyes that had been opened by a Highland bull's unwavering sense of right and wrong. The immediate aftermath of Ranger's rampage had been a period of profound soul-searching for Vincent. As he stood among the ruins of his material possessions, surveying the $250,000 in damage that the bull had inflicted with surgical precision, Vincent had been forced to confront the reality of what he had become. The terror he had felt while cowering in his study had given him a glimpse of the fear and helplessness that Timothy lived with every day under his father's emotional abuse. The insurance investigators who came to assess the damage were baffled by the selectivity of the destruction. Every item that belonged to Vincent had been systematically destroyed, while Timothy's garden area, Rose's herb patches, and even Jake's work equipment had been left completely untouched. The lead investigator, a man with 30 years of experience in animal-related incidents, admitted that he had never encountered anything like it. This wasn't random animal behavior, the investigator told Vincent as they walked through the ruins. This bull demonstrated a level of intelligence and purposefulness that challenges everything we think we know about animal cognition. It's almost as if he was making a moral judgment and delivering consequences based on that judgment. Vincent knew the investigator was right, and the knowledge haunted him through sleepless nights as he began to truly understand what his treatment of Timothy had cost both of them. The boy's depression had deepened in the weeks following the destruction of his toys, and no amount of expensive therapy or medical intervention seemed capable of reaching the damaged places in his young heart. Dr. Patricia Williams, Timothy's therapist, had been blunt in her assessment during a private meeting with Vincent. "Your son is suffering from complex trauma caused by repeated emotional abuse," she told him with professional directness. The burning of his toys was just the final incident in a pattern of cruelty that has convinced Timothy that he is worthless and unloved. If you want to help him heal, you need to fundamentally change how you interact with him. The turning point came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Vincent found Timothy sitting in his wheelchair by the window, staring out at the pasture where Ranger grazed peacefully. The boy's expression was one of profound sadness, but there was also something else, a flicker of connection with the bull who had defended him when no one else would. "You like watching Ranger, don't you?" Vincent asked, sitting down beside his son's wheelchair for the first time in years. Timothy looked up at his father with surprise, unsure whether this was a trick or a genuine attempt at conversation. "He's my friend," the boy said quietly, his speech careful and deliberate due to his cerebral palsy. "He knew you hurt me, and he made you stop." The simple honesty of Timothy's words hit Vincent like a physical blow. His 8-year-old son, despite his disabilities and the pain that had been inflicted on him, was still capable of recognizing friendship and justice in its purest form. Ranger had become Timothy's protector and champion, filling a role that should have been occupied by the boy's own father. "I'm sorry, Timothy," Vincent said, his voice breaking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I'm sorry for burning your toys, and I'm sorry for all the cruel things I've said to you. You didn't deserve any of it, and Ranger was right to be angry with me." Timothy's eyes widened with amazement. He had never heard his father apologize for anything, and the admission that Ranger had been justified in his actions was more than the boy had ever dared to hope for. "Do you really mean it, Daddy?" Timothy asked, his voice trembling with hope and fear in equal measure. "I mean it more than I've ever meant anything in my life," Vincent replied, reaching out to take his son's hand for the first time since Timothy was a toddler. "I've been a terrible father, and I want to learn how to do better. Will you help me?" The conversation marked the beginning of a transformation that amazed everyone on the estate. Vincent began spending time with Timothy every day, learning about his son's interests, his dreams, and his remarkable intelligence that had been hidden beneath years of emotional suppression. He hired new therapists who focused on building Timothy's confidence rather than trying to fix his disabilities. And he created spaces in the house where Timothy could play and explore without fear of criticism. The relationship between Vincent and Ranger also evolved in unexpected ways. The bull, sensing the change in Vincent's treatment of Timothy, gradually shifted from adversary to cautious ally. Vincent would often find himself talking to Ranger during his evening walks around the estate, thanking the animal for the harsh but necessary lesson he had delivered. "You saved my son when I was too blind to see that he needed saving," Vincent would tell the massive bull as Ranger listened with apparent attention. "You saved me too, even though I didn't deserve it." Rosa, who had watched the Sterling family dynamics with growing concern for years, was amazed by the transformation she witnessed. "It's like Mr. Vincent became a different person overnight," she told Maria Santos during one of their kitchen conversations. "He looks at Timothy like he's seeing him for the first time, and Timothy is starting to smile again." The most dramatic change came when Vincent decided to rebuild Timothy's toy collection, but this time with his son's direct involvement. They spent hours together researching different types of animal figurines, with Timothy explaining the characteristics and personalities he had given to each of his lost friends. Vincent commissioned a local artisan to create a new wooden bull, even more detailed and beautiful than the original Brave, as a centerpiece for the new collection. "This one should be called Ranger," Timothy suggested as they examined the finished carving, "because that's who really saved us." Vincent's business practices also underwent significant changes as he began to apply the moral clarity that Ranger had forced him to confront. He established programs to help employees with disabled family members, funded accessibility improvements in his hotels, and became an advocate for inclusive employment practices. The man who had once seen disability as an embarrassment now understood it as simply another form of human diversity that deserved respect and accommodation. Dr. E. Williams documented Timothy's recovery with professional amazement. "I've rarely seen such a complete turnaround in a trauma case," she told Vincent during one of their sessions. "Timothy's confidence is returning, his depression is lifting, and he's beginning to trust that he is safe and loved. The change in your relationship with him has been the key to his healing." But the Sterling estate became a different place entirely, filled with laughter and conversation where once there had been only silence and tension. Timothy's joy returned gradually but steadily, and he began creating new stories about his toy animals, tales of forgiveness, friendship, and the power of standing up for those who cannot protect themselves. Ranger, meanwhile, had returned to his peaceful existence in the pasture, but his role as Timothy's guardian remained unchanged. The bull continued to watch over the boy with protective vigilance, and Timothy would often spend hours by the fence talking to his unlikely champion about his day and his dreams. 1 year after the incident that had changed everything, Vincent stood with Timothy in the garden watching Ranger graze in the evening light. The area where Vincent's expensive possessions had once been destroyed was now a playground designed specifically for children with mobility challenges, filled with adaptive equipment and spaces where Timothy could play safely and joyfully. "Daddy," Timothy said, as they watched the sunset paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and purple, "do you think Ranger knew that breaking your things would make you remember how to love me?" Vincent considered the question seriously, looking at the magnificent bull who had delivered justice with such precision and purpose. "I think Ranger understood something that I had forgotten," he replied, pulling his son close. "He understood that protecting the innocent is more important than protecting things, and that real strength comes from using your power to help others rather than hurt them." As they walked back toward the house together, Vincent reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Ranger's intervention had cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars in material possessions, but it had given him something infinitely more valuable, a relationship with his son built on love, respect, and genuine understanding. The bull who had witnessed a father's cruelty and delivered swift justice in response had taught them all that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. Through Ranger's actions, a broken family had learned to heal, a cruel man had found redemption, and a disabled boy had discovered that he was worthy of love and protection. In the peaceful quiet of the Colorado evening, with Timothy's laughter echoing through the house and Ranger standing sentinel in the pasture, Vincent Sterling finally understood what true wealth really meant. It wasn't measured in dollars or status symbols, but in the love shared between a father and son, and in the knowledge that even the smallest voices deserve to be heard and cherished. The Highland bull had delivered justice in his own way, and in doing so, he had saved not just Timothy, but the entire Sterling family from a future defined by cruelty and emotional poverty. Sometimes the most powerful transformations come not from human intervention, but from the moral clarity of a creature who understands that every innocent soul deserves protection, love, and the chance to flourish.